Thank you. There's an online version that you'll find through the link in the chat. We'll put you on our email list so you can receive information about all that we do. We strive to be a congregation that welcomes people of all ages, races, religious beliefs, backgrounds, sexual orientations, gender identities, and abilities. We belong to the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, and we are guided and inspired by its values and principles. We remember that this part of the Connecticut Valley is unceded homeland of the Pecumtuck, Nonotuck, and Western Nipmuc peoples. Our values and principles remind us to acknowledge our responsibility to confront the legacies of dispossession and systemic racism that are part of our history, even as we also affirm the legacies that inspire us. We have drawing materials and other ways to occupy hands on tables and back. Restrooms are downstairs and are reached through one of these doors. You can either take the stairs or an elevator. Please return the same way. We stream our services online, and there is a camera that looks down on the Great Hall and shows people's heads. If you prefer not to be seen on camera at all, then we suggest you choose one of the 4 or 5 rows in the back of the hall. We're here to celebrate and to reflect and to support one another. It is good to be together. And Bill Diamond has an announcement before we begin our service. He's right here.
Thank you. I'm Bill Diamond of the Climate Action Group. The Decarbonization Capital Campaign ends next Sunday, October 15th. We're well on the way in phase 2 to ending our use of natural gas in this building and more. Please participate and give something to this campaign to share in our community effort and our community feeling. You'll see in the pew a yellow card that looks like that with a dandy QR code and a website that you could take home with you and pledge at home, or you could put a check in the plate with decarbonize in the memo line. You will be happy to be part of this. Thank you.
And now we'll begin our service. Hope rises. It rises from the heart of life here and now, beating with joy and sorrow. Hope longs. It longs for good to be affirmed, for justice and love to prevail, for suffering to be alleviated, and for life to flourish in peace. Hope remembers. It remembers the dreams of those who have gone before and reaches for connections across the boundary of death. And hope acts. It acts to bless, to protest, and to repair. Now I invite you to rise in body or spirit for our chalice lighting, and we will follow that immediately with our hymn, Where Do We Come From? And we'll try it this week in a round. Flame, we kindle you again today, yet in truth you burn always, in the magic of human connection, in the miracle of earth's abundance, in the call to hope and justice. Burn bright before us, burn bright within us. Okay, we're gonna sing it through once, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. I will join 4. Good. Huh? You need the mic. Do you have the mic?
This morning is a Haudenosaunee creation story in honor of Indigenous Peoples Day tomorrow. The Haudenosaunee people are an alliance of 6 Indigenous nations, including the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is considered to be the oldest participatory democracy on Earth. And there's many versions of this creation story, so the one that I'm telling today is an adaptation of a few different versions. And it begins a long, long time ago, during a time where the Earth was actually covered in water. It looked very different than it does today. High above the Earth, there was the land of the happy spirits, which was also called Sky World. And the beings that lived in Sky World were able to make things happen just by thinking about them. So they were pretty magical. In the middle of Sky World was the Tree of Life, which was a giant tree, and maybe you can imagine it. It had fruits of all different kinds growing on the one tree. But one day, the Great Spirit came and grabbed that tree out from its roots and took it out, which left a giant hole in Sky World. And Great Spirit's daughter was curious about this hole, so she leapt right through. And she started to float down from Sky World. And that woman looked like something people had never seen, the animals had never seen before, and so they called her Sky Woman. And they saw her floating down, and the birds were worried, so they decided to work together to help Sky Woman. And the birds came together to make a blanket to help Sky Woman as she was falling down towards the earth. Thank you, birds. And well, first what they thought was they could maybe bring her back up to Sky World, but they weren't quite strong enough. So they brought her down, down, down towards the earth. Thank you, birds. And they deposited her on Turtle's back. Turtle said, well, let me help out. I think that I might be a good spot for Sky Woman. And the birds put her on the turtle's back and they flew away. Thanks, birds. So there she was. Sky Woman had landed on Earth on Turtle's back. And the animals of the water thought maybe they could help. So you're going to have to imagine Sky Woman still on Turtle's back. But first, fish came to see if maybe they could help out with Sky Woman's new situation. And fish swam down, down, down below the water and got some soil and tried to bring it up for Sky Woman. But unfortunately, fish's fins were not quite strong enough to bring that soil back up to the earth. Next, Beaver came and offered some help. And Beaver tried to swim down below that water to get some soil, but beavers' tails are pretty heavy and they're not very good at going deep. So Muskrat appeared. People don't often think that muskrats can be very strong or powerful, but in this case, in this story, Muskrat made it all the way down and Muskrat didn't give up. And when they got their soil, they came back up to the surface of the earth and they made it back to Turtle's back. And they put just a tiny handful of soil on Turtle's back. And when Sky Woman saw that soil, she started to dance and she started to sing. And as she was singing and dancing, that soil multiplied. And she dropped seeds from the Tree of Life on the earth. And she sang and she danced. And by the time she was done, she looked around and there were plants and there was land as far as she could see. And that is why the Haudenosaunee people call the land where we live Turtle Island. And that is why we are here today.
And now it's time for us to greet one another. You can turn around and wave to all the people who are with us on Zoom. And then take a moment to briefly greet your neighbor. Hello, Zoom people. It's good to see you all. Sally, Chris, Wendla, nice to see you again. Who else is there? Hi, Lori. Hi, Kathy. Alex, nice to see you. Claire, Kamala, Lucy, Jane, Laura, Ginny, Gail and John, it's always good to see you. Karen, Lori says hi in case you didn't see it. Allison, who else is here? Sally, Emily Diaz-Lore, nice to see you, and David and Sheila, Steve and maybe Teresa too, Peggy, glad you're here. We're gonna take a shorter greeting this morning because we got started late. We have a message from Alex Zinglas who says, welcome from the Midwest UK. So, now it's time for anyone going to religious education activities to leave, and we will, oh no, yeah, we did that. I'm watching the slide going, greeting? No. And we will sing you out. So for a reading, we have another origin story. We're using poems and stories of indigenous people in the first part of the service. There is scientific evidence for the theory that a single population of modern humans migrated from southern Siberia toward the landmass known as the Bering Land Bridge, way up there in Siberia, as early as 30,000 years ago, and crossed over to the Americas by 16,500 years ago. And in Paula Underwood's origin story, which was passed down through her family for many, many, many generations, the story tells about that migration and begins before the migrations. And I'm just going to read you a little bit of the first part. It's called "The Land of So Long Ago, No One Remembers How Long." Then our people were settled with the mountains to our back, facing to the east and to the south. Our center was a sand beach lying at the foot of the mountains, curving away to the left and the right, ending in sharp cliff faces where the rocks broke away and fell straight down to become one with ocean. In that time, when the world was cold, the deep, dark places in the mountains were valued for their warmth. And when the world was warm, the open beach was of greater value. 2 times had beach disappeared beneath a rising ocean. Little was left at high tide. And 2 times had the sand reappeared from beneath a shrinking ocean. In each such time, since the world was filled with greater cold and the deep, dark places were of greater value, it was logical to conclude that much of ocean went away somewhere to become ice. And since it was known that to the north and west the world was colder at these times than it was at ocean's edge, it was logical to assume this great ice lay to the north. And at that time, our people sent out a party of go and see. And did they return, wrapped in fur, to speak of great cold? And during this time, our people came to know the nature of the world around them.
Good morning again. I'm still Corky Klimczak, and this is a Social Justice Minute from the Safe Relations team about upcoming anti-bias workshops we are offering as part of our commitment to the 8th principle of Unitarian Universalism. Thanks to the Racial Justice team, I recently read a moving reflection entitled My Dear White UUs by Rumi Saha, a Hindu member of a UU congregation in the Boston area. We all grew up in a world that modeled and still models too many biases and oppressions to name. Rumi describes the often uncomfortable experiences of Black and Brown people who are in UU congregations made up predominantly of white people who are trying too hard to be welcoming in a superficial way that can be discomforting. Rather than feeling welcomed, the people of color often feel othered and wonder if this is somewhere they could really belong. While acknowledging the good intentions of her fellow congregants, Rumi explains that, quote, being good, compassionate, and ethical does not free them from being insensitive and hurtful, intentional or not. Even when there is no conscious malice at work, unconscious white privilege often is. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, who were filled with many overt biases. In my teens, I consciously joined my liberal parents in rejecting my grandparents' biases. But I was horrified to realize later how many of them live on in me at an unconscious, perhaps even cellular level. Given that 70 to 93% of all communication is nonverbal, I have to wonder how often I am signaling my unconscious biases nonverbally, despite my conscious intention to be accepting and welcoming to all. The Safe Relations team encourages you to join us in exploring and challenging our conscious and unconscious biases in a Zoom workshop next Sunday, October 15th, from 6 to 8 p.m. It's one way we can all live into USNF's commitment to working to dismantle white supremacy, racism, and other forms of systemic oppression. Because the workshop is on Zoom, you can invite friends and relatives from anywhere. They don't need to be part of our congregation, so I hope you'll do that. The Zoom link and a link to information about the workshop leader are in the Sunday Times. The workshop leader is Amihan Matthias, a racial equity consultant and social justice activist. She led a popular workshop on cultural humility here a few years ago. And please mark your calendar for the follow-up in-person workshop on de-escalation skills on Sunday, November 12th, immediately following the service. We'll provide a light lunch. Welcome team and security team members are strongly encouraged to attend, but we hope many others in our congregation will join us as we practice questioning our biases and learning skills to de-escalate conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Corky. Every week we take an offering to support both the society and wonderful organizations outside our walls. And last Monday, the Coordinating Council selected 5 organizations from nominations made by the congregation. And Laurie, if you change the slide, I might be able to remember. I can tell you what they were. No. Let's see. Climate Action Now. Somebody help me here. The Sojourner Truth School, American Near East Refugee Relief, Neighbor to Neighbor in Holyoke, and we got Sojourner Truth. There's one more. Oh, the Communities for Restorative Justice. Yes, and we'll tell you a little bit more about each of those organizations as we go along. We'll be supporting all of them between now and the end of January. Our morning offering will now be given and very, very gratefully received. Sometimes prayer is a good idea, such as on the day after we learn that Israel is at war with Hamas. So you can hold that if you want, or you can set it aside. This is in a different vein. It's an excerpt from a poem by Roberta Hill, who is a member of the Oneida people. And at the end of the silence, we'll just start singing together, Spirit of Life. In these rivers, on these lakes, the lake spirit saw the sky. North of here lies Bdo Te, center of the earth. Through their songs, the wind held on to visions. We still help earth walk her spiral way, feeling the flow of rivers and their memories of turning and change. Our next reading comes from Adrienne Marie Brown, who is a writer and activist whose work is inspired in part by the parable novels of Octavia Butler. Butler wrote, "God is change. We must help to shape change." She writes, "There are in my lineage ancestors for whom I am likely their worst nightmare. A Black, queer, pansexual, polycurious, unmarried, childless, defiant, feminist, post-capitalist earth lover, constantly thinking about what might be the most revolutionary next step I could take. Yes, I know there are ancestors who would feel they had failed in their work because I exist. But what I know, which maybe these ancestors have some sense of now, is that the impulse to dominate and control and harm and deny the truth of divergent human experiences, that impulse is rooted in self-loathing." And then she says, "I have to honor that those ancestors lived in a time of less knowing, less connectedness, and less possibility. I have to honor that their lives are crucial to my callings. And so I pass my current experiences of freedom and delight back to the ancestors who did not have access to rest or agency over their time. I pass my current experiences of self-love and radical acceptance back to my ancestors who thought they could only belong through some version of destruction of themselves and other people. Where do you come from? What origin stories do you know? What did your ancestors leave for you to honor or to move past and seek to repair? So I've been inspired over the last few years by Indigenous creation and creation stories and invitations to explore but not appropriate Indigenous spiritual insights. In them, there's this animistic sense that earth and ocean, lake, moon, sun, all are imbued with spirit. Now, it's hard for me anyway to believe that Paula Underwood's story was passed down in some form for over 30,000 years. The skeptic in me also asks if it's possible. And I wonder where that skeptic came from. From ancestors? From patterns passed down for generations? Corky said a little bit the same thing, but I certainly also had ancestors who thought they could only belong through some version of destruction of themselves and others, to belong through marginalizing others. And that is not an idea that has magically vanished. So in June of 2023, the Reverend Cecilia Kingman delivered an essay that was subtitled Reflections of Fascisms Within and Without. And that was for the Berry Street Conference, which is an annual event featuring a UU minister as its speaker that happens at the ministers' meetings just before General Assembly starts. So Kingman has studied totalitarian systems and regimes. She spent 2 decades working with the Unitarian community in Eastern Europe, which, as some of you know, was under communist rule until the mid-80s to 1990s. Kingman writes, I come from many generations of white settlers and colonizers. 3 of my 4 grandparents were descended from some of the earliest English settlers. At least 2 of them had ancestors who enslaved other human beings. And this is where she says, I have a personal connection to the project of violent conquest, genocide, and displacement. My family didn't use those words, but that was the truth. And she goes on, just as people assigned male or female as children are taught to believe in certain ways and behave in certain ways, so are white children taught to believe and act in ways that distinguish those who are deemed white from those who are deemed not white. Some children are taught the myth of their own separateness and superiority. When they fail to comply with gendered or racialized expectations, they experience at a minimum the removal of approval and connection, which can be traumatic. And Adrienne Maree Brown has said something like this: what I know, which maybe these ancestors have some sense of now, is that the impulse to dominate and control and harm and deny the truth of divergent human experiences, that impulse is rooted in self-loathing. Now, I heard Cecilia Kingman deliver this essay this past June, and it was powerful and disturbing to listen to. And it is powerful and disturbing to read it. So she began her talk with all these warnings and invitations to the audience to take care of ourselves as we listen. She said, I encourage you to get up. Please get up and walk around if you want to. Please feel free to leave or leave and come back. And she had also arranged for caucus rooms for people of similar backgrounds on identities where they could gather if they wanted to after the talk. So I'll just say, I would be happy to talk with anyone probably in the parlor if you're interested in sharing your responses after the service. We can do that. And I'll issue my own invitation and caution. Some of this is really difficult to hear. And so you're welcome to take care of yourselves. You can get up and stand in the back. You can leave, you can come back. If you're interested in this, but you don't want to deal with it right this minute, it's easy to find her entire talk. It was a very long talk on the web. You just have to Google Kingman and fascism and throw in good UU, or if you can't find it, just send me an email and I can send it to you. There's also an article from the UU World that gives a little synopsis of it. So Kingman says that white children, some white children, not all, are socialized and taught they're superior to people of other cultures and races, and that there are expected restrictive behaviors that go along with keeping one's privileged place. And she says young white children experience trauma from this. So I've struggled with this. How much of that might be true for you? So I thought, what was I taught at a very young age, starting at a very young age? Say before I was 5, what was expected? And were there parts of myself that I traded away? I think one could ask those questions for a long time, but I do remember, sit still, pipe down, you have to be a good girl. It was very important to be a good girl. And I know my sister Betsy and I were punished more than once for making too much noise. Gendered expectations are a little easier to think about. Boys still today hear variations of man up and stop crying and don't be a sissy. And Stacey Abrams wrote, as a woman, it's frustrating to realize we're taught to be humble in a way that men are not. So I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. I keep asking myself, was I explicitly taught that white is superior? I don't think so. My parents, my mother especially, were liberal, and her paternal grandfather was of mixed race. Her paternal grandfather was indigenous and Black. Her father was white. Her grandfather and grandmother had adopted him when he was 3 years old. So my mother had known and been fond of her grandfather, who had lived with them for several years when she was a child. And she was also an active supporter of civil rights, which was all over the news at that time, and affirmative action. She talked about them at the dinner table. On the other hand, there were no Black children in my elementary school at that time. There were no Asians that I can remember. And I remember when the first 2 Jewish kids showed up in my class. It wasn't until 4th grade. There were no people of color in positions of authority that we could see, or in, for example, the media. So I definitely grew up with lots of implicit messages. So again, you might want to think, what did you learn, whether or not you were told it directly? I know I learned indirectly that educated people, people like my family, were better than other people. And I also learned that one does not say this. And I was brought up with the country's founding myths. To the extent I also remained ignorant for much of my life about the depth and breadth of systemic racism and the ongoing oppression of Indigenous peoples, I think I have been. It's a harsh way to put it, what Kingman calls a generational participant in massive historical violence and enrolled in maintaining the mythologies that perpetuate it. And she also says that at some level, white Americans are aware of that participation, and the awareness results for white people in a form of moral injury, a moral injury that's passed down from one generation to the next. She says, people who are taught early to believe the myth of their superiority and what she calls the immoral deal one must make to trade away parts of oneself. Those are people in a position to be vulnerable to fascist ideologies. So let's take a break and sing together. Think of all the wonderful ancestors you have and sing hymn number 1051, We Are. invested in another 3 pages and made this easier to follow. And next time we sing it, we'll try to give you the map ahead, but this one's really tough. It's a good song, though. For each child that's born, a morning star rises and sings to the universe who we are. But does every star shine alike? Is every star as beautiful as the next? Fascists make that answer an emphatic no. Fascism is defined as a mass political movement that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and the supremacy of both the nation, as they define it, and the single powerful leader over the individual citizen. That's from Cecilia Kingman. There are, of course, many factors contributing to the rise of fascism, not just here, but across the world. Fear of the other, fear of change, fear of complexity, fear of the future, now especially including climate change. So fascists use a number of related tactics, deliberate tactics, to advance their agenda. Fascism is an ideology, but also, perhaps more importantly, a political method. Jason Stanley is a Yale professor, and he's an authority in the field who has cataloged the tactics, and you can also actually find him on YouTube. Much of what I'm going to say is taken from Kingman's essay, which she told us she took directly from Jason Stanley. And he lists 10 tactics of fascism. And as I said, they all work together. The first is evoking a mythic past. Fascists tap into and exploit nostalgia for a supposed better, earlier time. Let's make America great again. The second tactic is propaganda, and one form of that is to cast the other as a threat and present the idea that those others are fundamentally opposed to the nation, anti-American. The third tactic is anti-intellectualism. Fascists work to take over the country's media, schools, and cultural institutions to enforce what the leader says is true. They ban books, they use their own media networks, they try to legislate what's taught. Expertise is a threat, science is a threat. Tactic 4 is a skillful and crazy-making use of lies. Authoritarians undermine facts to convince people that everyone is lying and the lies don't matter. Just follow what the leader says, even if you know or suspect it's not true. Jason Stanley says, if you are going to rip the heart out of democracy, you get people used to lies. Then there's hierarchy, white supremacy, male supremacy, abled supremacy, that assign people superiority and the privileges and benefits that go with superiority. And along with that comes victimhood. Fascists tell people equality is victimizing them by making them lose their rightful place or power. And you can think of countless examples of that, all the legal challenges to affirmative action. Fascists also seek to eliminate both democratic processes and marginalized communities to return to that almost often fictitious and glorified past, where their power reigned unchecked. Think of all the tactics of voter suppression, elimination of polling places, race-based gerrymandering, the gutting of the original Voting Rights Act. Then there's law and order. The definition of who's law-abiding means those who are loyal to the dominant group. Law and order will ultimately be enforced by violence. Tactic number 8 is sexual anxiety. The fascist leader says, your women and children are under threat, and fascists make conservatives overwhelmingly terrified of transgender rights and gay, lesbian, and bisexual people and their families. Fascist movements also typically rest on an urban-rural divide. When politicians talk about inner city voters or urban voters, we know what they mean. Black and queer folks, immigrants, Jews, other people they seek to control or eliminate. And finally, the 10th tactic is what Stanley calls Arbeit macht frei, work shall make you free. These words were hung over the gates at Auschwitz. Fascists create an idea that minorities, immigrants, and others are lazy and need to be taught a work ethic. They also claim unions are run by communists who are trying to make things easier for these lazy people. Take a breath. It's an appalling list. It's really hard to listen to. I was taught explicitly and implicitly that it isn't polite to talk about difficult or controversial subjects. From that, I also learned to keep my worries to myself. And it's shocking to hear directly that physical attacks and other attacks on the rights of gay, lesbian, and transgender people are a deliberate part of the fascist agenda. I hadn't thought about it that way until I heard Cecilia Kingman speak. The same is true for attacks on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and on people in the climate action movement. You know, I'm sure most of you know, or all you know, that 10 days ago, a man named Jacob Johns, an Indigenous leader, was shot and seriously wounded at a peaceful vigil and protest in New Mexico. Johns is an activist and an organizer who has dedicated his life to Indigenous and climate justice. He's also an artist. He makes murals, and he specializes in nonviolent, peaceful artivism. You know somebody else who does that. He's a member also of the UU Church in Spokane. So what can we, as individuals and as members of a religious community, do? I think we need to talk about the problems. And Cecilia Kingman and many others advocate following the leadership of those who have been struggling under historic oppression, those most under attack. She says, no one knows better how to see through the lies, how to resist, how to protect one another. Follow and learn from those who have struggled, Indigenous peoples who have claimed or reclaimed the wisdom of their ancestors and are waging their own battles. Black, brown, gay, lesbian, trans, and non-binary folks. The best thing I saw in the news this past week was the picture of the newly appointed senator from California, LaFonza Butler, being sworn in by Vice President Kamala Harris with Butler's wife holding the Bible. It was just a gorgeous, gorgeous picture of three wonderful Black women. Our USNF The Vote efforts are centered around organizations that are led by people of color, most notably the Center for Common Ground. Kingman also said, voter organizing is no longer a fully sufficient strategy, and we can't keep careening from one election cycle to another. We must work in coalitions to shape a multi-year plan for keeping fascist policies in check. And I think people on our USNF The Vote team have been aware of this and working hard to work in coalitions and work in collaboration with other congregations and with organizations like the Center for Common Ground, and move on. What else can we do? We can advocate for transgender and reproductive rights and work to undermine the restrictive laws. Heather Vickery is an activist and organizer who works for the UU Service Committee, and she reports that transgender people who are forced to move from their home states for their safety fit the United Nations criteria to be designated as internally displaced people, refugees. On the first Sunday in November, Heather will preach here, and she'll tell us about her work and the UU Service Committee's work with transgender refugees. and how we might be able to help. We're not bound by what our ancestors taught us, wittingly or unwittingly, to feel and believe. We can choose how we want to be in the world. I know that many of us have learned a lot over the past 5 years or so and are in very different places, I certainly am, than I was 5 or 6 years ago. We can keep learning. We have to keep learning. Maybe even learn how to help Earth walk her spiral way, feeling the flow of rivers and their memories of turning and change. We can be inspired by the voices of people that we may not have heard of yet or overlooked. And we can do what we're able and trust that others will do what we cannot. Where do we come from and where are we going? These are frightening times, they're difficult times, and we're not helpless. We can honor all that is good in our heritage and move beyond it. We can, as Octavia Butler said, shape change. We can help to shape the change that the next generation of leaders is helping us see we really need. Our children and our grandchildren, everyone's children and grandchildren, are calling us. And maybe our ancestors are calling us as well. Our final hymn is number 168 in the gray hymnal, One More Step. Please rise in body or spirit and join in singing. Hope rises, hope acts, hope longs. Hope acts to bless, to protest, and to repair. Go in peace.